Welcome to the web meeting of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, Great Lakes Legislative Review. The caucus holds these web meetings to give members regularly scheduled opportunities over the course of the year to stay apprised of issues the organization has been tracking or might wish to track. These web meetings are also useful for updating the members on Great Lakes Legislative Caucus activities. My name is Lisa Hanairo. I'm with the Council of State Governments and I staff the caucus, and I'll be managing the logistics for today's webinar. The caucus's annual meeting event each year for interacting and conducting business. Registration for the annual meeting opens today for Great Lakes Legislative Caucus following this web meeting, and I'll have more information on the meeting at the end of our program. We'll go over some housekeeping tips. First, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be available later today at greatlakeslegislators.org. To reduce noise on the phone lines, all the participants are in listen-only mode, and they're going to stay that way during the presentations. After the presentations, there will be time for questions, so you can either click on the raise hand icon in your webinar console, or you can type your question using the questions pane. If you are calling in only and not viewing the slides, I will not be able to see you to unmute your line. And of course, you won't see the webinar console to type in your questions. In that case, if you do have a question, you can email it to me at, I'll just give you the easy one, gllc@csg.org. If you do wish to speak and you're viewing the video, you must enter your audio PIN in order for me to unmute your line. This is the agenda for today. We'll hear first from Senator Darwin Boer, who is the chair of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. Following Senator Boer's welcome, we'll hear from our featured speaker, Matthew McKenna, and then we'll follow Mr. McKenna's presentation on federal legislative activity with a regional roundtable involving members of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus Executive Committee. We'll have a short business session at the end, covering 4 topics, and we'll adjourn as close to 1 hour as possible. And now I will turn it over to Senator Darwin Boer of Michigan, chair of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. Senator Boer.
Thank you, Lisa. And welcome everyone to this webinar. Can everyone hear all right? Can they hear my voice?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for attending today's web meeting. In the interest of time, I'll skip the usual introductions to the GLLC and just remind everyone that the caucus is the only binational, nonpartisan organization dedicated solely to educating, engaging, and serving state and provincial legislators from the Great Lakes region. Our organization was founded in 2003 by a small group of legislators, one of whom was, like me, a Republican senator from Michigan. That person was Patricia or Patty Burkholz, who sadly passed away on May the 3rd. Patty went on to become our first chair and served in that capacity until she was term limited out of Michigan, the legislature, in 2011. Throughout her tenure in the legislature and afterwards, Patty was tirelessly an advocate of the Great Lakes. Her spirit lives on, and we will always remember her as the founder of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. We'll be honoring Patty this fall at our annual meeting, but I wanted to take a few moments here today to remember her as well. And she is the primary reason that I was part of the Water Caucus. I want to start now, introduce the topic and the speaker. Let's move on to our featured presentation today Web meeting is an annual event during which we share information on legislation and funding measures being considered at the federal level, as well as in the states and provinces. Our featured speaker on federal legislation in the U.S. is Matthew McKinney from the Northeast Midwest Institution, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and policy organization based in Washington, D.C. As director of the Great Lakes Program for the Northeast Midwest Institute, Mr. McKinney works with the congressional offices and the administration agencies on the Great Lakes Protection and Restoration Programs initiatives. Mr. McKinney is a frequent speaker on GLLC web meetings, so we are welcoming him back. I would like to now have Mr. McKinney go ahead and make a presentation. So, Mr. McKinney?
Thank you very much, Senator. I really appreciate the kind words. And I also want to thank all the listeners today for calling in. And I also want to thank the Legislative Caucus for all the work that you do in your states in protecting and providing the necessary resources to preserve the Great Lakes. I think I have control over the slideshow, do I?
No, Matt, you'll just have to ask me to advance.
Okay, so I guess we can just go on to the next slide. Thank you, Lisa. So we're fortunate today that there's actually a lot going on in Washington that impact the Great Lakes. You can't always say that for an election year. Obviously, we're going into a midterm election, so politics sort of right now rule the day down here in D.C., but on more of a policy basis, there are a lot of impactful things going on. I'm going to lead off just quickly going over the FY 2018 Omnibus Bill. I'm sure many of you on this call are aware of a lot of the provisions that were included. Before I get into the specifics of some of the Great Lakes meat and bones, I'm going to talk to kind of set up how Congress got to passing an Omnibus Bill and also how it set up the current appropriations process. In February, Congress actually agreed to a 2-year budget deal that increase the yearly appropriations government-wide, the discretionary spending for FY18 and FY19 by an additional $300 billion. So in most of the funding goes to defense programs, about $165 billion over those 2 years. But for non-defense spending, there's $131 billion additionally included, and for FY19, the upcoming appropriation cycle, will be $68 billion additional for those appropriation bills, and I'll get into more details about those levels shortly. Additionally, the budget agreement included $90 billion in disaster relief in response to the hurricanes and wildfires that occurred in 2017. It increased the debt ceiling. It also created several select committees charged with looking into multi-employer pension plans, and also a committee that's tasked with drafting overhauls to the current federal budget process, which I'm sure everyone on this call is aware has kind of hit a bunch of roadblocks over the last 5 years. So they've created a committee to look at how the government could improve their budget process. And both those reports will be due on November 30th. One of the big things that the budget agreement in February did not achieve was an agreement on immigration reform, specifically on the Dreamer status, and that's come into play in other legislative initiatives, including the Farm Bill that we'll discuss a little bit later on the call as well. But as you can see, the budget agreement led to a massive omnibus bill that basically funded all 12 appropriation bills for FY18, and there were some really good provisions for the Great Lakes, including the full inclusion of $300 million for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. There were pretty significant increases in the state revolving funds with the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water. WIFIA grants were funded at the highest level that they have ever been funded. That's a Water Infrastructure Financing Initiative Act, which was created under a Water Resource Development Act. The Land and Wildlife Conservation Fund got a significant increase from its funding at the FY17 levels to $425 million. I forgot to write the word million in there, so it's not $425. I apologize about that. Some grant programs that had been created in the WIN Act. The WIN Act was a Water Resource Development Act, but also included provisions with Flint, and it was passed in, I believe, late 2016, and it created 3 new grant programs focused on lead in drinking water, and so those programs were funded through the omnibus bill. It also included money for the Great Lakes Mississippi River Interbasin Study, which is the federal study that the Army Corps is currently working on that includes the Brandon Road study. And operation funds for the electric fish barrier that's currently in Romeo, Illinois. That's the main defense against Asian carp moving up the Chicago area waterway system towards Lakes Michigan. So those are all, I think, really strong provisions that are very impactful to the Great Lakes region that were included in the FY18 bill. So we can move on to the next slide. The one thing the president has recently sent Congress is a rescission package. Basically, the rescission package allows the administration to recommend to Congress certain budget cuts. Most of the funding, in fact, there are no specific rescission plans in the president's proposal that really impact the Great Lakes. Obviously, you'll see $10 million for EPAs up there. That funding is basically, it was authorized funding that hasn't been paid out by the government, and most of this funding does not even impact the 2018 Omnibus Agreement. However, the administration has indicated that they would like to send future proposals to Congress to possibly look to rescind some of those funds. The way the process works is the president sends his rescission package to the House Appropriations Committee, and then the Appropriations Committee, under those recommendations, can move forward with legislation to send it to the House floor. It is unclear if they are going to do that at this point. The administration's proposal was sent a couple weeks ago, and the Appropriations Committee has, I think it's up to 25 days to actually send legislation to the House floor, and then if the House is able to pass it, then it would move to the Senate. And in the Senate, it's not a 60-vote threshold like most legislation typically is. It is just a pure majority, so it's 50 votes. From my intel, I think most appropriators are kind of take the position of we've dealt with FY18, let's move on to FY19, and they've really kind of moved full step ahead with trying to get the FY19 appropriation bills moving. So I think it's probably the future of the president's rescission plan that he sent is probably not likely to pass, especially in the Senate. If it were to move forward in the House, I think getting the 50 votes, even though it's a simple majority in the Senate, is very difficult because the Senate right now, the makeup of the membership is very tight. So I think that they would have a tough time getting all 50 votes on a package to rescind funds. Next slide, please. I just wanted to include a quick slide to give you kind of a big picture of timing down here in Washington. Obviously, I mentioned the midterm election, and that's going to play a big part on scheduling, but basically, Congress is coming back from the Memorial Day weekend, Monday or Tuesday night, I think, in the House. I expect them to be basically in session for the next 7 to 8 weeks. They will have a week off during the 4th of July holiday, but then they'll go right into their summer recesses. The House begins theirs about a week earlier than the Senate, so they'll be out from July 30th through September 3rd. One quick note is that the National Flood Insurance Program is set to expire on July 31st. I'll get into brief details about that and the prospects there. But then the Senate will begin their recess beginning August 4th, and they'll return the same day as the House. When they get back in September, there are a couple major programs that are up for expiration. Obviously, the current fiscal year ends September 30th, but additionally, the Federal Aviation Administration's authorization expires. I feel like Congress will be able to address that in the near-term future. It looks like the House has already passed an FAA bill that's it's very non-controversial. It passed by overwhelming margins, and the Senate would like to move a bill. Hopefully, this month. It might happen in July. Their floor time is pretty jam-packed, but I think they're on the road to be able to. Well, road is probably the wrong word for FAA bill, but I think they've got the votes in the Senate to move forward a pretty non-controversial bill and have that authorized before it's set to expire. The Farm Bill is a different story, and we'll discuss that in a couple moments, but that would be a bigger task. So you could see very well an extension at some point, extending the Farm Bill so that the nation's agriculture policy doesn't lapse. The VAWA, which is Violence Against Women Act, domestic violence program, Congress will have to address, and then also emergency health preparedness authorities. Those authorizations, I think, should be no big issues, but it's just something I wanted to put out there just so that you guys had a good feeling for what Congress has to finish up by September 30th. Once October begins, obviously the new fiscal year will start, and so Congress will either pass their appropriation bills. I think it's more likely that you'll see them pass some sort of CR, which is a continuing resolution, and I'll talk about the FY19 appropriations process in a bit. And then the House is set to adjourn for the election on October 15th, returning on November 12th, and the Senate October 27th. It's very possible that if the House or Senate doesn't have any timely business, that they could even adjourn a little earlier, because I know that there's, especially in the House, there are a lot of competitive races this term, so I feel like that the leadership is going to want to get their members back in their districts so that they can be talking with their constituents and working on their elections. And then just quickly, November 30th, we'll start a lame duck session here in Washington. Obviously, the lame duck will be dictated a lot by the election results. And the House their target adjournment date is December 13th, and the Senate is the 14th. And as I mentioned before, I expect it likely that the CR will be in effect. So I think you would see a big funding compromise being worked on during that lame duck session. The next slide, please. So just kind of these are the big ticket items that are on the agenda right now in D.C. We've got obviously the 19 appropriation bills, the Farm Bill. Both chambers have been working very diligently and moving pretty quickly on a Water Resource Development Act, a WRDA bill. Immigration's an issue, a very big issue. I'm just going to talk briefly about it on the Farm Bill front. The FAA authorization I already talked about. The NDA is the defense bill. That's an annual authorization that Congress passes every year. Last year there was ballast water provisions in the bill. This year those provisions aren't. That language isn't in the House bill. And then the flood insurance program, I'm just going to briefly touch on now. Like I mentioned before, the expiration of the flood insurance is at the end of July. The Senate Banking Committee is working on legislation right now, and I know Senator Schumer from New York has been very vocal about wanting to have the Senate and Congress act upon a new reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program. I think it's more likely that you'll see an extension of the program and not a big authorization bill. I think the Banking Committee, from my understanding, is still a little bit far away from being able to send something to the floor, and I'm not sure the floor time is there. But I would think that Congress will at least address it in an extension. Next slide, please. So here are the FY19 appropriation allocations, otherwise known as the 30B allocations. As you can see, the House and Senate numbers are pretty similar, but they differ a little bit. And I should have created a column, and I realized this morning, comparing it to what the FY18 omnibus discretionary spending numbers were, just so you had a better idea. And I can provide that in another document. But just so you know, most of the bills see slight increases. Some see minor decreases, like The agriculture bill is basically level, a tad bit below what it saw in the FY18 omnibus bill at 23.3 billion. CJS, which is Commerce, Justice, and Science, they're seeing an increase in the FY19 numbers. Their FY18 was 59.6 billion. I think the two subcommittee or two appropriation bills that typically touch upon the Great Lakes the most, the energy and water, which is the Army Corps of Engineers budget, is seeing a slight increase in FY19. Their FY18 overall number was 43.2 billion. And then the interior bill, which includes the EPA, will see an increase of a very slight increase from their FY18 number, which was 35.2 billion. I think the Senate's number is probably a little higher, and the House number is actually almost the same as it was in 18. So you can go to the next slide, please. So now how the House and Senate plan to attack their appropriations process is a little different. Typically, the appropriations bills are originate in the House. The Senate does have their own bills, but the House typically is the vehicle where the appropriations are born out of. The House plans to act in a series of minibuses. So what the House is going to do is they're going to roll multiple appropriation bills, likely 3 to 4, into a bill and have one big package go on the House floor over the next month and a half to 2 months. They're going to kick that off starting next week, where they'll be taking up a package that will include the energy and water appropriations bill. They'll include the ledge branch appropriations bill and also the military construction and veterans affairs appropriations bill. They plan to start working on these bills and then try and just knock them through. And the House Appropriations Committee is actually pretty far along with marking up their bills, and so that's what the slide here is showing. The House Appropriations Committee has already fully marked up the ag, energy and water, transportation, the transportation bill, and the subcommittees have marked up the interior and financial services. I did not put the MilCon and legislative branch on that, but they've also marked up those bills as well. And the Senate's a little farther behind at the committee level, but they've actually really put together a pretty aggressive agenda starting next week to mark up their bills. Next week, they plan to mark up on the transportation and HUD appropriations bill. The following week, they'll have an interior environment bill and also the commerce, justice, and science bill. And they plan to finish up marking up all their bills by the end of June. So that's a pretty aggressive schedule. The Senate committee in the past hasn't been able to move all their bills out of committee. I know that from my discussions with folks in the Great Lakes delegation, we're lucky to have several key appropriators from Senators Duckworth and Durbin, that they feel that they can move all the bills out of committee. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll be moving the appropriation bills on the floor. My guess is that you'll see the House pass all the bills and then figure out some sort of continuing resolution so that they can move a big omnibus package, whether it be one 12-bill omnibus like they did in FY18 in March, or if it's several bills. I would suspect the Senate's only going to move bills on the floor that are kind of the big packages that have been kind of pre-negotiated by both chambers' appropriations committees. And just quickly, just so you know, the energy and water bill next week has a couple Great Lakes focused amendments. One key one that I noticed, the Rules Committee hasn't met yet, so I can't guarantee that this amendment will be accepted, but I suspect it will. Is Congressman Kildee from Michigan has introduced an amendment, a proposed amendment that would prevent funds from being used to permanently store nuclear waste in the Great Lakes Basin. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to jump into the Farm Bill. I thought it would be helpful just to kind of give a brief overview of the timeline that we suspect will move forward. June, this month, could be a very busy month for the agriculture community and the DC policy. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, in mid-May, the Farm Bill failed on the House floor, and it was kind of unexpected. Just so people are aware, the Farm Bill that's been written in the House, the Senate bill hasn't been released yet. I'll get into that in a little bit. But in the House, it was really written mostly by the Republican majority. And so when they brought the bill to the floor, the Democratic caucus decided that they were not going to really introduce any amendments, and that they were not and they were very unified, and they were not going to vote for the bill, namely because of the nutrition title, which deals with the supplemental nutrition, the SNAP food stamp program. I'm trying to blank on the acronym, but that was the most controversial part, with a lot of reforms with work requirements, and then also pretty dramatic cuts to the program. So right off the bat, the Republican leadership in the House lost every single Democratic vote. And then also the conservative House Freedom Caucus decided that they wanted to try to leverage their position on immigration and get a more conservative immigration vote in order. And they were not necessarily sold on the leadership's guarantees that they would get that vote. So a lot of their membership voted against the bill, and that's kind of what sunk the bill. Speaker Ryan did use a procedural motion so that he can bring the bill back up in the future at any point. So basically where that stands now is that they are trying to figure out how to move the votes forward. I think the consensus has become that the conservative Freedom Caucus now feels that they will be getting their vote on the immigration package that they desire, the Goodlatte immigration bill, before they bring back the Farm Bill, which could be probably the middle of June at earliest. Like I said before, the Senate hasn't yet introduced their bill. It's expected that there's going to be a markup held mid-next week, likely on June 6th, although the Ag Committee has not formally announced that. We expect that if they do formally announce their markup, they would have to likely post their legislative text 24 hours before the markup. So it would make sense that we would see a Senate Farm Bill Monday, Tuesday, if a markup were to occur Wednesday. I think that would be most likely. I do think the Senate version, Chairman Roberts and Ranking Member Stabenow from Michigan have been working very closely, and I know that they've in the past had a really good working relationship. So I know that I think on the Senate side, there's probably more inclusion of the Democrats, and I think that's just typical of the U.S. Senate too, that because of the way the 60 vote thresholds, the majority and majority parties typically try to work on a broader bipartisan legislation. So if the Senate can mark up their bill early and then move an actual farm bill this month, and I think I put in the slides, the farm bill on the Senate floor is a pretty lengthy process. If it's open fully to amendments, we could be looking at a couple weeks on the floor, just because of the way the Senate works. Ideally, if the House could pass a bill in June as well, they could set up for possibly reconciling bills in July, and having a conference report either late summer or early fall. I think that's a pretty optimistic outlook, and I think there will be a lot of differences between a Senate and House bill. Obviously, as I mentioned before, the nutrition title is going to be a little bit more controversial, but there's going to be differences on the conservation title, which is kind of the title that I'm going to focus on in my next slide. So I suspect that we could be seeing some sort of extension. But how long anyone knows at this point, but it would not surprise me come fall that we would see an extension of the Farm Bill. So the next slide, please. So I'm going to focus just briefly on the conservation title. The conservation title is under the House bill. We do not know what the Senate bill will look like yet. I think ideally you'll see on the Senate bill baseline funding for conservation programs. On the House side, there are actually cuts of about $795 million over 10 years. Now, the conservation title has not been the most controversial title of the Farm Bill, but a lot of organizations that are focused solely on the conservation title do have some issues. One of the main ones is the elimination of something called the Conservation Stewardship Program. Just a brief overview, the Conservation Stewardship Program helps agriculture producers maintain and improve their existing conservation systems and adopts additional conservation activities to address priority resource concerns. So participants earn CSP payments for conservation performance. So therefore, the higher performance, the higher the payment. So basically, the House bill gets rid of the Conservation Stewardship Program and merges it into something called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or otherwise known as EQIP. EQIP provides financial and technical assistance to agriculture producers to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits such as improved water and air quality, conserved ground and surface water, reduced soil erosion and sedimentation, or improved or created wildlife habitat. So the CSP and EQIP do kind of focus on similar aspects, but CSP is, as I mentioned before, more performance-based, so it really is the better you are implementing conservation techniques and technologies, the more funding you're going to be eligible for. So while EQIP is actually increased in the bill, with the elimination of CSP, it's actually a decrease in a lot of the conservation programs. So there have been a lot of concerns among conservation organizations about that provision. And next slide, I'll quickly, briefly go over the other major conservation programs that are in the bill. The CRP, or Conservation Reserve Program, basically provides rental payments to producers that replace crops on environmentally sensitive lands. I think the good news is that you can see in this chart the acreage caps have been increased under the House bill, which is a good thing. But I think there's still concerns that even though the acreage caps have been increased, certain rental rates per acre might be cut by the bill. So the actual rental rates that a producer or farmer would get for renting his land out might be lower than what they currently are. The Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, which provides financial and technical assistance through two types of easement programs. One, agriculture land easement, that basically limits non-agriculture uses on productive farm or grassland. And then the other is a wetland reserve easement that protects and restores wetlands. I think generally the House bill is pretty good, and it actually increases and restores the baseline funding to $500 million. As you can see from the 2014 Farm Bill, it had actually been going down a little bit, and the FY18 it was down by a significant margin. So I think the House bill does a pretty good job on the easement programs. And then the other one that I'll touch upon in my next slide as well is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And this is really the multi-state watershed scale projects. And it was a new program that was started in the 2014 bills. One of the main authors of the RCPP was Senator Stabenow, who was the chair of the Ag Committee, is now the ranking member. And this was something that she really worked on with stakeholders to try to address conservation efforts not only at the state level, but multi-state and actually watershed level. So for places like the Great Lakes or Chesapeake Bay, it's really important to address the issues, not just looking at what the farming industry in Michigan is doing, that it has to be a regionally focused thing to get the biggest bang for your buck. So it's been something that I think has been successful. There's been some issues with it, with some of the paperwork and all that, and I'll get into my next slide. So the next slide, please.
Matt, this is Lisa. I know you have a few slides left, but in the interest of time, we'll need to wrap up in a few minutes.
Okay, so I'll just quickly say that Senator Stabenow, along with Joni Ernst, have introduced legislation that would kind of address some of these concerns with the RCP program to improve it. So I'll move to the next slide because I do want to quickly touch on the water bills. So in the House and Senate, like I said, they are moving pretty quickly on water bills. The House is expected to take up their bill next week. The Senate bill has a lot of Great Lakes provisions in it, including upping the authorization for the GLRI by $30 million in FY19, and then increasing that by $30 million each in the successive year up to FY21. And another thing that I think was really interesting that was included in the Senate Word bill, and you can see there's the kind of a laundry list on the slideshow, is it authorizes a Great Lakes resiliency study to coordinate strategy and recommend actions to manage and protect the Great Lakes coastline. So I think for coastal communities that could be a really effective provision. Next slide. The House Word bill does not quite have as many of the Great Lakes provisions that the Senate bill has. So one thing the House bill is much more of a straight up Army Corps authorization for Army Corps projects. But the House bill does permit the full use of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for dredging and harbor maintenance. So any money that goes into the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund must come back to ports and to dredging activities. And then there's those amendments there, just so you know, the House Rules Committee is going to be meeting Tuesday night, and therefore those amendments haven't been made in order. They could, or they might not. I can provide an update to anyone that's interested to know what amendments were accepted and how they fared on the House floor. I'm happy to provide that update. And then quickly, the last slide I had was just to briefly talk about the ballast water legislation that has been proposed, the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. I know a lot of people have been following this closely. Just quickly, the bill removes the jurisdiction of ballast water management from under the Clean Water Act. Currently, ballast water regulations regulated by both the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. EPA. Under this bill, the U.S. Coast Guard would be the sole regulator of ballast water. Veto was included in the Senate Coast Guard authorization bill that moved to the floor earlier this year. While it looked like they had the 60 votes to move forward and limit debate, at the last moment, led by Great Lakes Democrats, they got a good chunk of their colleagues, including 3 Democrats that are actually co-sponsors of the VITA legislation, to vote against moving forward debate. And basically the end game on that was that they moved the bill back into negotiations, and the Great Lakes leadership is trying to figure out now a solution to move forward that all parties could support. So the short of it is, I think the Coast Guard bill, I know the Coast Guard bill without the ballast water provisions would pass with probably 100 votes in the Senate, but they need to, if they want to include the VETA bill and the ballast water language, they're going to have to figure out a compromise that some of the environmental organizations are concerned with the removal of EPA's jurisdiction. So I think there's still work to be done. It's definitely an issue that could pop up in a lame duck session. So it's something that we will continue to monitor here. And with that, I can open up to any questions. Sorry if I went a little long.
Oh, that's quite all right. We appreciate you had, like you said, there's a lot of information to share because there's a lot going on, which is kind of unusual in an election year. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or type them into the questions pane. Or those of you who are on the phone line only and not viewing the slides, if you send me an email at gllc@csg.org, I can read your question on the phone. I don't see anyone with their hands raised. Senator Boer, do you have a question
Yeah,
for Matt?
Yes, Matt, thank you again for your report. This, when you started, you said this two-year budget. Does that mean that the $300 million for the Great Lakes restoration is then secure for 2 years?
So it is not, but the good news is on the House side, they have released an interior bill and they've included the full 300 million, and I don't see why the Senate wouldn't as well. I think there's tons of support in both chambers for GLRI, and in fact, to see them in the WRDA bills pushing forward an increase in the authorization levels, I think is a really good sign saying that this is a program that they realize is working. And if they can pass a WRDA that increases the authorization levels in FY19, 20, and 21, that I think would be a really great indication on the support that GLRI has received. Even though the administration has proposed dramatic cuts to it, Congress has basically said, no, we are going to continue funding this program at the authorized level. So,
thank you. Lisa, I wonder if we could get a hard copy of the presentation. Certainly up here, I wasn't where I could see it. All I could do is listen to it. So could that be sent out rather than just email you and ask for it? Could
Yes.
I have you just go ahead and forward that out?
Yes, Senator, I'll do slides and also a link to the video of the presentation. I'll send that out to all the attendees later today.
Thank you very much.
And I don't
I
see
have no
any
other questions.
And I don't see any other questions posed. Matt, I do have some questions for you, but I can follow up with you later on that.
terrific.
So at this time, Senator, I'll turn it back to you so that we can move on to the regional roundtable.
Thank you. Again, thank you, Matt, and as always, and it's very interesting to me as a member of the appropriation for the state of Michigan to follow the appropriation process. So thank you again. Look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you.
So if you want to stay on, Matt, you're welcome to stay on. We'll move into our roundtable, and so it's time for us to hear from our members of our executive committee who will at this time share brief reports about legislative activities in each of their own jurisdictions. We'll start with our Canadian friends and members. So Quebec, Guy, if you're on. Anyone on from Quebec?
Mr.
If not,
Willett?
Ontario?
Wait, no, his line is
Yes.
unmuted now. There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Guy?
Thank you.
Okay. I'm pleased to present this overview of the legislative and policy-related development implemented in Quebec since September 2017 in connection with water resources protection. First, let's take a look at the maritime strategy launched 3 years ago in June. The strategy March 12th update confirmed close to 300 initiatives and projects in 15 regions of Quebec. Together, these actions represent total investment of 1.7 billion and covers various sectors such as tourism, transportation, fishery, and aquaculture. They are responsible for creating or maintaining more than 9,000 direct and indirect jobs, which put Quebec in a very good position for achieving its goal of 30,000 maritime strategy-related jobs by 2030. The National Assembly unanimously passed a bill which came in force on March 23, 2018, amending the Environment Quality Act. Provides for the progressive implementation of a new environmental authorization scheme, which will apply to, among other things, the compensation measure for development project affecting wetlands and bodies of water. Note that the Assembly also passed the act respecting the conservation of wetlands and body of water in June 2017. This new act reformed the framework for wetlands and bodies of water in order to modernize conservation measures. Concretely, the act affirmed the collective nature of water resources and provide for increased water resource protection while recognizing the ecological function of wetlands and body of waters. The measure sets out in the act are intended to prevent the loss of wetlands and body of waters and to foster the development of projects that minimize impact on those environment. The Energy East Pipeline Project, the Albertan Trans-Canada Pipeline Company, announced on October 5th of 2017 that it was putting an end to its Energy East Pipeline project. The pipeline was to run through several provinces from Alberta to New Brunswick. Before getting the project started, TransCanada needs to be given the green light by the competent federal authority, the National Energy Board. The Energy Board was tasked with assessing the risk associated with potential accident and system malfunction that could, for example, lead to an oil spill into the environment. In addition, the National Energy Board has decided to consider greenhouse gas emission related to Energy East project to determine if the project submitted was in the public interest. TransCanada decided to abandon its pipeline project after analyzing the new requirements set by the National Energy Board. By the same token, it also withdrew from the environmental impact assessment to be conducted in Quebec. In February 2018, the Quebec Department of Forest, Wildlife and Park confirmed the presence of Asian carp in at least 12 different locations along the St. Lawrence River for 2017 alone. It seems the carp have adopted certain sectors, such as the leg of the St. Lawrence River that stretch from Boucherville to Sorel-Tracy, and the mouth of the St. Francois River, which flows into the Lac Saint-Pierre lake head. This means that southern Quebec main watercourse risks being colonized by the invasive species. To act on Asian carp propagation vectors, the department intends to continue implementing sound practice for cleaning small boat and managing water and fish pond. In 2016, Quebec allocated 1.7 million over 3 years to the fight against the invasive species. At our last meeting, the Quebec Department of Forest, Wildlife and Park indicate that it is trying to adopt response protocol for catching this fish species. Special attention will be paid to dams and fishways to limit the Asian carp propagation to inland waters. An action plan is also forthcoming. And in conclusion, just recently, the federal government announced in its budget that it was allocating 20 millions over 5 years to the fight against Asian carp. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Guy. It's good to hear your voice. Ontario, and Julie, you're on or not?
Julia, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Julia,
Hi.
before you begin, may I interrupt? I just wanted to mention to the executive committee members or others who were planning to speak, if you are calling in and not viewing the presentation, you need to call back in using the same phone number that you used, but a different access code. And that access code is 671-237-872. Again, 671-237-872. Thank you, Julia. Apologies. You can give your report.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm giving our report today on behalf of Speaker Levac. It'll be fairly quick because right now our Parliament is dissolved for election, which will be happening on June 7th. So prior to the dissolution of our Parliament, the following things were the most significant updates for Ontario. Firstly, under the 8th edition of the Canada-Ontario Agreement on Great Lakes and Water Quality and Ecosystem Health, Canada and Ontario decided to focus on remediating 5 particular AOCs with the long-term goal of delisting our remaining areas of concern by 2025. In terms of Lake Erie water quality, earlier this year, Canada and Ontario together released a final action plan for reducing the amount of phosphorus being discharged into Lake Erie. Our budget was presented right before the election was called, and in the spring budget, about an additional $52 million over 3 years were committed to the Great Lakes. However, that being said, we are in election mode right now, and any of these policies and any recent legislation that was introduced will be subject to review by whoever is next elected. So there could potentially be some changes. One other thing, right before the dissolution of Parliament, one of our MPPs, Lisa Thompson, introduced a bill to designate June 7th as Great Lakes Day, but it didn't make it the whole way through the process. So the bill is basically null because of election time. And one more quick additional note. I know it's been a topic of interest to the caucus, the Deep Geologic Repository. The future of it is still uncertain, and that still rests with the Canadian federal government. So no significant updates on that front. And that's about all I have.
Well, thank you, Julie, for that report as well.
Very welcome.
I understand that Kurt, Sonny from Pennsylvania, you have no report today, if you're on, Kurt, or not. We'll jump to Minnesota. Senator Amrest, do you have, or Representative Jen Schultz, a report from Minnesota?
Representative Schultz.
Muted.
This is Representative
Schultz, your line is open now.
Okay, this is Representative Jen Schultz. I just have a few items. Our governor vetoed a lot of our legislation that was introduced, but we do have funding to improve water infrastructure going forward. And I also want to note that I did send Lisa some dates for the Great Lake Superior Days, and if we're going to coordinate that with our Canadian provinces. And the last item is that I want to make members aware of the U.S. Water Alliance. They have a One Water Summit conference coming up in Minneapolis, July 10th through the 12th. And I know the Great Lakes Commission is going to send a delegation, and I'm hoping some of our members will attend that conference. It's all about water quality, water infrastructure. And again, those dates are July 10th and 12th, and you can register online at the U.S. Water Alliance website.
Thank you, Representative. Anything further?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Michigan Representative Matern, are you on? Can you see if he is?
He is, and I'm unmuting his line. Representative Matern?
Okay, am I on?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes.
Lovely. Okay, well, I just sent you an email. I wasn't sure if I could get on or not, and I didn't know if Senator Boer was going to go ahead and talk about items first. I had 3 items, and I'm trying to remember exactly what they were. But first of all, I guess our governor has issued an emergency order prohibiting people from anchoring in the Straits area. We had an incident where a tugboat was dragging its anchor and actually hit a communications line, which let loose some of the fluid there. I think relatively inert, if I'm not mistaken. You can correct me. But it also happened to put a little ding in the line 5 energy line for line 5, the oil pipeline that runs on the floor of the Straits. So we're hoping that that will make people a little bit more aware of what's going on. So please don't toss out your anchors in the Straits, because there's a lot of important stuff down there on the floor of it. We put $50 million into to our budget for our contribution towards a new lock at the Sioux. It's critically needed that we have another lock there in case something happens to the pole lock. And it certainly is important, I think, to anybody on the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, and probably lots of other folks in the country, to make sure that we have a way of getting between the Great Lakes there on the St. Mary's River. I think that's about it. I'll let our chair, Senator Boer, pick up anything that I missed. So thank you.
Well, Dave, you struck on two of the key items that I had on the report, but I guess I would just tell the members that there's been a bill introduced in the House. It is House Bill 5638 that will provide clarity and consistency in the site-specific review process for water withdrawal assessment tool. So we'll be looking, the House will be looking at that, I'm sure, pretty soon. Other things would be the Great Lakes and the Freshwater Week, as June 2nd through the 10th in state of Michigan. And a third item that we need to talk about just a little bit is that we put in the state in a supplemental $1.7 million to do a survey for a comprehensive report on PFAS that we had a webinar on here just a little while ago. And in that total supplemental included $23.2 million. And this budget we're working on will include additional funding as they branch out to test all public wells, all schools for lead, or for PFAS in the state of Michigan, not lead, but PFAS. So that's, Michigan will push hard on the PFAS problem that we have in the state of Michigan. That would be it for my report. I'll probably report more on that in our gathering in Erie this fall. So with that, after we want to move into our
Senator Brewer, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do have Representative Dan Ramos on the line from Ohio.
Okay.
And I believe Senator Karen Talion is calling in. We'll start with Representative Ramos.
Okay. I apologize for that. I thought we did not have a report there, so thank you.
No, my apologies. Representative Ramos, your line is open.
Thank you very much, Lisa, Senator, and everyone. It's my fault. I had some technological issues, so I missed the first few moments of the call, I think, when everyone probably introduced themselves and said hello. I will start initially to say we're in an odd state of limbo in the state of Ohio in that our speaker resigned mid-session. It's a long story involving the FBI and a lot of other things. It's not important here, but what is important is that we cannot, by our rules and by the laws of Ohio, pass any legislation without a speaker there, because only the speaker can call a bill to the floor. So all of these are pending, what I'm going to say, but I can't tell you whether or not we're going to even pass anything else, let alone these specific bills. But I'll start with the one that has the most likely chance of passing. There is a bill, House Bill 643, Representatives Patterson and Arndt, which will actually add money to the Lake Erie Fund and to conservation districts, allows for financing, and it also adds funding to Stone Lab, which is our Sea Grant facility. It's actually located in the lake. It's on an island in the Western Basin, so it's very important, especially as you all know the issues we've had in the Western Basin of Lake Erie, especially our friends in Michigan and Indiana know, and Ontario, with the algal blooms that have been centered there, because that's the shallowest part of the shallowest lake, and it's also the warmest part. There is House Bill 460, again, Representative Patterson, Representative Mike Sheehy. This would exempt qualifying riparian buffers, the buffers around watersheds from property taxes, and in order to incentivize making sure that we have those important buffers. House Bill 62 would bring Ohio into line with the Conservation Reserve Program from the USDA. And establishes the Ohio, by doing so, it establishes Ohio Water Quality Improvement Program, which provides tax benefits for removing land from agricultural production and introducing plant species that improve water quality, which is particularly important around Lake Erie, since we are both the most industrialized and most farmed of the Great Lakes basins, and have the least amount of forest. And also we're shallower. We have House Bill 655, Representative Sheehy again from Toledo, that would regulate the total application of fertilizer within the Western Basin to a level to basically a level at the agronomic rate. In other words, you can only put down what the land can naturally absorb at the time. This again is to fight the algal blooms in the Western Basin. Obviously, it's only within our state, so that's something I know Representative Sheehy and I and others are hoping that that's something in the future we can coordinate with our friends in Indiana, Michigan, and Ontario to fully deal with that problem. Lastly, a more negative bill, House Bill 393. Once again, this has been passed out of committee, not to the floor yet, but as I said, it may get there if we ever decide to elect a speaker. It would allow for fracking brine to be used as a commodity for de-icing, snow control, dust control, etc. In other words, it allows frack water to be sprayed openly onto roads. Obviously, that could cause a problem of contamination of the Great Lakes, not only Lake Erie, but of course Lake Ontario as well. Lastly, this isn't I do have an amendment to that I'm working on to ban it within the Great Lakes Basin. I don't want this anywhere in my state sprayed around, but if the people in the Ohio River Basin really want it that much, they can contaminate their water, not mine. And lastly, this is an issue of Great Lakes commerce. I'm sure many, if not all of you, have seen yesterday President Trump decided to unilaterally start a trade war over steel and aluminum by imposing tariffs on our friends in Canada for reasons I fully don't understand and frankly don't agree with. And then Prime Minister Trudeau did a dollar-for-dollar tariff on American-made steel. I have steel mills in my district, but obviously the steel industry of both of our nations are intertwined, but in so many cases are very much use the Great Lakes as the way the steel is worked. The ore mines in northern Minnesota and southern Canada directly create the steel in my district. I can tell you that. So that's something we should all keep an eye on for Great Lakes trade. Obviously, this also deals with the European Union, and so moving our steel up and down, American steel up and down the St. Lawrence to Europe isn't going to happen as much either. So that has ramifications not just for the steel industry, but for all of our ports if the demand is lowered. So that's something we should all keep an eye on. I have calls out from everyone to the White House, to Minister Freeland, Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, a bunch of members of Congress, just trying to figure out what the impact is for each of our states. But that's something to keep an eye out for.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And
Elisa?
then the last report would be from Senator Karen Tallien. If her line is available, she was calling in. Senator Tallien, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Wonderful.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. I also was having some technological difficulties, couldn't get into the regular webinar, but I am sitting in for Ed Charbonneau here on this one, and he asked me if I would just give you a little update. I'll be quick because I know we're at the end. We had basically three main bills in our 18 session that deal with Great Lakes issues. One of them is a bill about, we're calling it the Sand on the Beach bill. As many of you may know, we have a big port structure and several smaller industrial structures that stick out into the lake, causing sand buildup on the updrift side and sand erosion on the downdrift side. Out there every year or so, all of these sand areas have to be dredged. And we have now been successful in getting a bill that said unless it's hazardous or toxic, the sand that's dredged has to be put back on the beach in the downdrift where it's been eroded on the downdrift side. So that was a big issue. Frankly, I've been working on that for 10 years. We also did beefed up our water infrastructure task force. We set up some new rules and regs to get this in place. We don't have money for it this year, but everything is now in place for next year's budget cycle. And the other thing that we did is to pass our Senate Bill 362, which is basically going to regulate water and wastewater systems. So as of now and going forward, whenever we do permits, the operators of a wastewater plant or a water treatment plant have to do life cycle cost benefit analysis, have to do capital asset management plans, have to do cybersecurity plans. The operators are also going to be required to be trained and certified. And finally, we're putting all of these regional water, wastewater districts and conservancy districts all together under the jurisdiction of our IURC, which is Indiana Utilities Regulatory Commission. So now all of these small plants are going to be regulated by IURC. So that's basically the report from Indiana.
Well, thank you, Senator, and we appreciate stepping in for Ed, and we are going to move along now pretty rapidly, if it's all right with everyone, as we're running over our time. So I'm going to move us right into the business section of our meeting session, our business session. So I'll start right in with that. We will now convene with that business session, and I'll give you an update on our strategic planning process. I'm pleased to report that the Executive Committee held a highly productive meeting in Illinois at the end of April. The meeting continued the discussions we began last September in Toronto. We drafted the strategic plan and a policy agenda that will guide the caucus through the end of 2022. We also discussed our goals for putting the caucus on stable financial footing and for how we want to interact with other groups as well as internally with each other. Based on that discussion, we're developing draft plans for communications and financial stability. The Executive Committee and 3 subcommittees will be refining all these draft plans over the summer with a goal of presenting them to the members in September at the annual meeting. The theme running through all of our discussion is our desire as the leaders of the caucus to transform the organization into a forum for coordinating regional action. We know how to educate legislators and bring them together. We're very good at doing that. We now want to build on that success by turning the best science-based recommendations through those members that can enact laws at the state or provincial level and appropriate funding. So many good studies are funded for the purpose of identification what needs to be done to better protect the lakes and our drinking water. Who better than legislators to take those recommendations out of studies and put them into practice across the region. So that's what we'll be focusing on in the coming years. This is an exciting time for the GLLC as we write the next chapter in our history. One more thing on the 2018 elections. Moving on to our upcoming elections this fall, the members will be electing a new leadership team to guide the caucus through the transformation. I'm not running for re-election, and the position of vice chair is vacant, so both officer positions are open. I'm term limited out in Michigan, and that will be a full 14 years I've been in the legislature in Michigan. In addition, the 10 seats on the executive committee are up for election, one from each jurisdiction. The nominating period will open on June the 20th, so watch for an email from Lisa. We have the volunteers to serve on the nominating committee, so we will be appointing that nominating committee very quickly. We'll contact Lisa as soon as possible if we have, or Lisa will be putting out the information after those appointments are made. Now I'll turn the floor over to Lisa for some announcements about the annual meeting and our upcoming special events. Lisa?
Thank you, Senator Boer. The annual meeting this year will take place on September 21st and 22nd in Erie, Pennsylvania at the Sheraton Erie Bayfront Hotel. As in past years, the event will kick off with an evening reception on Friday, September 21st. There will also be an optional site visit that afternoon for those who are arriving early. And also the executive committee will hold a meeting over lunch on the 21st. On Saturday, the full day program will feature presentations on federal activities in the U.S. and Canada, safe drinking water laws in the region, climate change and its potential impact on lake levels, and policy barriers affecting the implementation of green infrastructure projects. There will also be morning and afternoon business sessions during which the caucus will consider resolutions and, as Senator Boer just mentioned, elect officers and members of the executive committee. Registration opens today for GLLC members, and an announcement will be arriving in your inboxes shortly after we're done here this morning. All other attendees will have to wait until July 2nd to register, and you can all watch for an email from me on that date. I want to see if Representative Kurt Sonny is available on the line. Are you there, Representative Sonny? I don't hear him, so I thought he was calling in, but he might have used a different code. Anyway, August 27th is the deadline for registering for the meeting and reserving a room at the Sheraton. The 27th will also be the deadline. Let me get to this page, sorry. It'll also be the deadline for submitting resolutions for consideration, and caucus members will receive a separate message from me later this month regarding the process. We have a limited number of travel scholarships available, but this year those won't be offered on a first come first served basis. Because of the limited availability, members will need to submit a brief application for a scholarship. All submissions will be reviewed in time for applicants to learn of their status no later than July 2nd. Also new this year, we'll be using CSG's new member engagement system to register all the attendees. Caucus members received an email from me this past Tuesday with instructions for activating their free accounts in this system. And I know some of you have already done that, and others had previously done that to register for the Midwestern Legislative Conference annual meeting. Please follow the instructions in that message to activate your account. Those of you who have already done so will be able to register for the 2018 meeting as soon as we're done here. Caucus members who signed into the system will also be able to view a members-only space, the new GLLC community. This online community is a place where members can share information, review proposed resolutions and sign-on letters, and find out about upcoming events. I encourage all members to check it out and let me know what you think by posting a comment online. In the interest of time, I won't walk you all through this space on today's web meeting, but I'll do so during a future session. Please contact me if you have any questions about the meeting, the online registration system, or the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus community. And finally, the caucus will take a big step forward this year in the development of a new biennial event, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Policy Institute. The purpose of the institutes will be to bring a small group of highly engaged members together for a deep dive into a single issue and to sketch out a plan for coordinated regional action to address the issue. The action plan by the members in the months that follow. This year, we're going to try piloting the Institute in Erie with 20 caucus members on September 20th and 21st, also at the Sheraton. The focus will be assuring safe access to safe, affordable drinking water. We'll use the lessons learned from this pilot to develop the next session, which will take place in 2019, and will focus on one of the issues on the caucus's new policy agenda. The commitment to participate in the Policy Institute extends beyond the day and a half in Erie. Attendees will be expected to stay in Erie through September 22nd annual meeting. They'll also be expected to attend 2 web meetings prior to the Institute to obtain the necessary background information to ensure a productive meeting. If you're interested in being considered for this event, please indicate so when you register for the annual meeting, and I'll follow up to send you more information. I want to thank the Joyce Foundation for its generous support of this pilot, as well as the 2018 annual meeting. Neither of these events would be possible without the foundation's support. Senator Boer, I'll turn it back to you for any final remarks.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for their attention today and their attending the webinar. Hopefully it's been interesting, and appreciate your participation. We'll see you all in September 20th, the 21st, and maybe the 22nd in Erie, Pennsylvania. And with that, Lisa, I have nothing more. Turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Remember, a link to the recording will be shared later today, and you can view recordings of all past web meetings by visiting the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus website. Members, watch for member updates that you receive from me by email. These are messages only for members, so I typically put actions in there, and I hope you're all getting them. If you're not, please send me an email, and I'll check our information on your email addresses. And then later this morning, watch for the early registration announcement for the 2018 annual meeting. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you will have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.